Look, Jack, the world is in a bit of a state at the moment, as we know. I mean, first there was Ukraine and Russia, then Israel and Palestine, and of course the West has been teetering on the brink of military conflict with China for years. Are we being led down the garden path to World War III, do you think?
Well, look, and I say this as someone who is a voracious reader of John Mearsheimer, Professor Mearsheimer, and his work. This was the man who predicted the Ukraine war and predicted how it would play out, that NATO and the United States were pushing and pushing and pushing further into Ukraine. And while in the West, and especially within Washington, D.C., I remember having served in the intelligence community, we always said everything NATO does is benign. Everything that we do is actually beneficial, where we are a benign hegemon. This is the theory, defensive alliance. But it turns out the Russians didn't quite see it that way. And it turns out that they didn't agree. And no matter how many times the U.S. State Department decided to tell Sergei Lavrov or Vladimir Putin that NATO certainly didn't have any plans to attack Russia, that he simply didn't agree. And then he looked at what NATO did in Libya, looked at Afghanistan, looked at Syria, and decided that he didn't want NATO on his border like that. And unfortunately, for Ukraine and for all of their warnings, they did not heed anything that Putin was saying. And they said, well, we are going to go ahead and get in bed with the West and go and push all of this. And Mearsheimer, I believe correctly, and I think we, as history is borne out, correctly pointed out that it was those decisions that led Ukraine down this primrose path of thinking that they could have their cake and eat it too, that they didn't need to worry about the warnings from Russia, that Putin was, that he was bluffing, that it was all a big bluff, that nothing would ever come of this. Well, it turns out that it wasn't a bluff. And it turns out that Russia takes their national security, their border security incredibly strongly, probably much more than anybody else in the West. And so they did, obviously, in February of 2022, conduct their invasion in order to get Kiev and get Zelensky to drop this bid for NATO membership, because they didn't want NATO bases along Russian borders. We're told that in March of 2022, by the way, I'm getting to answer your question. I know I'm going down a long road, but I'm going to get to answer your question. And we're told that in March of 2022, that Boris Johnson came over from the UK to visit Kiev. Now, around this time period, and we know this from, and you mentioned Israel-Palestine, Naftali Bennett, the then prime minister of Israel before Bibi Netanyahu came back to power, Naftali Bennett was acting as the go-between between Zelensky and Putin. He would fly to Istanbul. He would meet with the interlocutors for the Ukrainians. He would go to Moscow. He would talk to Putin. He would talk to Zelensky. And he said that there was a peace deal in the works, that basically a draft had even been signed off on this already, instituting a peace between Ukraine and Russia, essentially a ceasefire, saying, look, all we want you to do is drop the bid for NATO and then take these provinces, these breakaway provinces, Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk, the three, by the way, that Nikki Haley was not able to name on the debate stage last night, which is just another funny thing to begin with. Russia has also annexed Zaporizhia and Kherson provinces, but these are really the three where the main fighting is currently. And so it was Boris Johnson and the West carrying out the West's wishes and to say, no, tear up that peace agreement, continue and extend a much larger war with Russia. That is what has occurred. So Putin had originally sent in, and the Kremlin had sent in about 150, 160,000 troops. Then they began a first wave of mobilization after that peace deal was torn up, drawing up another 300,000 troops. Now we're told that as many as potentially 700,000 troops stand at the ready in order to be able to conduct further operations into Ukraine at this very moment. And as obviously in Ukraine, they're getting into the winter months, they're getting into that cold tundra. People, I remember last year, were saying that, Russia's going to have a lot of trouble. I think the Russians know how to fight in winter. They're the Russians, after all. This is kind of what they do. They're somewhat familiar with this. Napoleon found that out, by the way. That this situation has been completely mismanaged to the point where now there's open political warfare within Kiev, some of which has turned into assassinations we've seen of high-level individuals, high-level aides, high-level politicians, breakaway politicians in Russia have been assassinated by what we are told, potentially Ukrainian forces. Pipelines, obviously from Nord Stream 2 to the Baltic Stream pipeline have been blown up, and Balt Connector have been blown up. And so this situation has completely gone off the rails. And in Washington, D.C., you hear people saying, we just need to send more money. We just need to send more troops. We just need to send more weapons. Then we hear the same thing in Israel. We said, we're going to keep going. We're going to push harder. We're going to allow this to go. And so it's sort of a dual track situation where you have so many people calling for complete warfare, and you have other people, a very small minority, but it is there in DC, and I would say it's growing, that of people saying, if this escalates further, either of these escalates further, you're now looking at a 1, 2, and then you mentioned China, 3, a potential 3-front global conflict.